This year, I promised myself that I would cut down on sugary drinks. Lisa say this has really helped. Sparkling water infused with raspberry and blackcurrant. So it's literally just sparkling water with a hint of fruit flavoring. No sugar, no sweeteners, no calories whatsoever. This is just making my promise a little bit easier. Anyway, so some of you will know that my profession is accountancy. I have mentioned it on the channel. It's what I do as a 9 to 5 and pretty much what pays the bills. Rewind back to 2021. I completed and passed my final exams, attained the chartered status. So in other words, becoming a fully qualified accountant. And with that means higher salary expectations, which, it's what we all want. At the time, I was getting frustrated with the company I was working for. I had been approaching my 4-year anniversary and there was no progression, and I felt pretty much redundant in my role. I trained an offshore team. This was the idea of management. They suggested that I train this offshore team because it would free up my time, pass on responsibilities to them so that I could take on new responsibilities. They even gave me a new job title to fit it. So everything sounded good on paper. In the end, nothing was passed on to me, and the offshore team became more and more efficient in doing their job. And as time went on, that meant that I was needed less. And it got to a point where even days went by where I was doing literally no work. And that became very frustrating because it was like, I'm making no progress. Now, some might think, oh, this is a sweet position to be in because literally you're doing no work and you're getting paid. But you have to remember that I was in a position where I had just recently qualified. I had, quite a lot of years experience on my belt, and I wanted to get to the next level. And so this was, I saw as something that was holding me back. I realized that my company were reluctant to declare my role redundant. I think they would have rather I just quit because it would have been cheaper for them. They actually did do the same thing to one of my colleagues who left a couple of months prior. And I mean, we both saw this coming, but I was determined to not just quit. So I raised the matter with HR, explaining the situation, how I felt. Raising it with HR was like the best thing that I could have done because I forced their hand. I didn't have to bow out. They were going to have to pay me something handsomely. And sure enough, they did. That was just a beautiful feeling because shortly after I was offered this fantastic position at a new company, and the role was basically what I was trying to get into, albeit I had less experience in that field. The pay was only marginally better than this previous role, but because of the opportunities that it did present, I was actually quite excited to actually start there. And I was able to give myself a 3-month break. So in March 2022, I left the old company, and in June of 2022, I started at the new company. What I probably should have mentioned earlier is that this new company I'm very familiar with because I had worked there before in a completely different department when it was a different profession that I embarked on then. In fact, this was around the time, not even around the time, it was the time when I was an undergraduate. So whilst I was studying a degree, it wasn't a great place to work at, but it was very easy to move around within the company because the company was so big, had so many different departments, and they had a very strong internal vacancy program. So it was easy to move around different departments. So I started a job full of so much enthusiasm. I was really excited. I thought it was going to be such a great experience. I remember reading over the job description over and over again and just feeling so pumped and ready to actually start. However, it went down as the worst job I've ever had. Like, it was an absolute car crash. So firstly, the job description was completely false. A long list of responsibilities, and I only remember ticking off 1 or 2 items that I actually did. I later found out that my team actually was formed after my interview, and this was not made clear to me when I actually interviewed for the role. The team was going through a discovery period where they were trying to figure out things, what responsibilities they would have, etc. Shortly before I started. Now, mind you, like I said, I started June 2022. So this would have been early 2022 when they were going through this discovery period, trying to figure out what their role would look like. However, the job specification that was provided to me was signed off in 2021. So they effectively signed off a document that was incomplete. They didn't know what the role was going to look like, and yet they were advertising it as though they knew. The department, they had this culture of constantly being on calls, and yeah, it just felt like you was in a sales room. I didn't quite understand why that was the case. I mean, coming from my background as an accountant, that's quite alien. I spend a lot of time looking and dealing with financial and non-financial data. So I'm mainly working with spreadsheets. So spending, I would say, about 60% of my time on calls, very foreign to me, just very alien to me. And I didn't like it. I spent maybe 60% of my time on calls, and it just felt unnecessary. Half of the calls I was in, I would say that I didn't actually need to be on there, because there was no contribution on my part. It was more of just there just to hear other people speak, and it probably would have been better delivered as a memo, just to send out to the team, just for an FYI basis, not something that was paramount. And even with the calls that I should have been in, it was clear to me that they just droned on longer than they needed to be. They could have been a lot more short and concise. I would say that one of the main culprits for dragging out my meetings was definitely my line manager. My line manager loved dragging out meetings. Definitely a micromanager. Wanted almost daily updates on progress, which obviously stagnated progress. I can't work like that, having to give someone minute details on what I'm doing. I just feel like, what are we? Are we in primary school that you have to keep constantly monitoring me? It's just not how I work. It's not efficient. It just shows that a lack of trust, and yeah, it was just not a good environment. It was quite toxic, and I noticed it with one of my other colleagues as well. This colleague actually went through exactly what I went through too. In addition, credit was not given when it was due. The colleague I'd mentioned earlier had worked on a project with very little direction, and I was brought on after the fact to help support this colleague. And it was very clear to me when I was brought on that there was a serious resourcing issue. The two of us were still not going to be sufficient enough. The funny thing is, I highlighted this, and my line manager made it seem as though this colleague of mine was incompetent, and that they had not done anything, and that was the reason why we were in the situation we were in, and that going forward things would be better. My manager got rid of this colleague and did not get a replacement. So needless to say, all that workload, which I already said earlier was already too much for two people, now sat with just me. So you can just imagine the stress levels went through the roof. I was so stressed. Additionally, I was made to feel that I didn't have the right attitude at work. I was told that I should be making effort to come into the office more often. And just complaining about me not doing overtime when you're not obligated to do that anyway. From time to time, I did actually do overtime, but I made a point of duty of making sure I didn't make it a habit. And the reason why that is because the workload is already too much. If I start doing overtime regularly, the issue is not going to be addressed. And that issue is we have a resourcing issue. So I'm not going to spin my wheels and be working crazy hours just because the company is not competent enough to realize that we need more staff to deal with this work. So yeah, I wasn't prepared to do that. And with regards to coming into the office more often, I personally don't see what the issue was, because firstly, they had a hybrid model where you're only required to come into the office once a week. I did make actually a habit of coming in most of the time 2 or 3 times a week. Well, originally, Then I scaled that back to 2, and then eventually I was only coming in once a week. And the reason why that is that when I was coming into the office, none of the staff members, none of my colleagues in my team were in the office. And so it was almost like I'm there by myself, everyone's at home. Why am I in the office then? I'm not interacting with anyone in the office. And secondly, also, when you're constantly on phone calls, it's just easier dealing with that at home rather than in the office where it's noisy, if that makes sense. So I addressed my concerns with the line manager about, the workload, etc., the whole situation with being on calls. And, I was just told that, everyone's working hard here, and, this is just normal business as usual. And I should just get on with it, that what I'm complaining about is a non-issue. So work volume continued to increase, and I continued to have discussions with line management about my so-called behavior. Part of the reason why I delivered very little content in 2022 was because of the role and the mental damage it had caused. I had mentally checked out. Genuinely believed that a case was being built to literally get rid of me. And then one night I decided to go on their careers website, and I saw my role being advertised. This infuriated me. Like I was pissed. I was so pissed. I worked so hard to get to where I was, and this person was making chess moves, discreetly trying to hire a new person and get rid of me. If that happens, I would not be able to use the company as a reference, and then I'll have this massive gap on my CV that I need to explain. So I did the most logical thing that anyone should really do in such a situation. I quit. Now, there is a caveat. I can't say for sure that the role I saw advertised was definitely them trying to replace me. It may be that they realized, management may have realized they do indeed have a resourcing issue and they need to hire. After all, they did get rid of my colleague earlier, and so naturally that would be a sensible thing to do. But I must highlight rather, that my colleague that they got rid of, that was over a month ago, okay? And this role was a fresh role. It wasn't like it had been there advertised for a while and I had only noticed it when I had gone on the website. No. This was a fresh post a month after that I had seen it being posted, and its expiry date was like a couple of days. So they were only intending to have this up for a few days. On top of that, it was also an open secret that they were going to get rid of my colleague anyway. My colleague had what do they call it? A secondment, and it was coming to an end, and they had no intention of keeping my colleague after the fact. So since they knew this, they should have been preemptive in finding a replacement, not getting rid of them and then a month later deciding to then hire someone. Although I can't categorically say it was a replacement for me, based on all the facts that I do have, it looked pretty darn convincing. Darn convincing. I don't even use words like that. But it seemed pretty clear to me that on the balance of probabilities, it's probably likely that this was a move to get rid of me. And yeah, like I said earlier, the conversations I had with line management about behaviors made it very clear to me that I was not liked, and yeah, they wanted me to go. The interesting thing is that when I finally handed in my notice, my line manager was extremely pleasant. Regardless of whether they were being genuine or not, it was a massive relief for me knowing that I was going to leave. I felt eternal peace, and for me, that's got to be a good decision if I'm feeling like that. And it paid off handsomely because I'm in a much better role that pays significantly more than what I was on before. So the moral of the story is, if you're not happy where you are, don't be afraid to quit. It might seem scary at first, but you know what? The universe has a way of balancing things out. See you next week.